Real inspectors don't show up looking like they're headed to a barbecue. Captain Marcus Brennan's words sliced through the morning air at Denver International Airport's Gate B-47, like a blade designed to cut deeper than flesh. The man standing before him, Jerome Williams, though Brennan didn't know that yet, didn't flinch. He simply reached into his worn leather messenger bag and pulled out a federal credential wallet. Jerome held it steady, letting the gold eagle of the Federal Aviation Administration catch the terminal's fluorescent lighting. His voice, when it came, carried the quiet authority of 15 years enforcing federal aviation law. "I'm the FAA Inspector. Try again." The words landed in the space between them like a detonation waiting to happen. Around Gate B-47, passengers looked up from their phones and coffee cups, sensing the electricity of a confrontation that was about to reshape everything they thought they understood about power and authority at 35,000 feet. Captain Marcus Brennan had ruled his aviation kingdom for 28 years with the absolute authority that came from 4 gold stripes and federal pilot certification. At 52, he carried himself like military royalty, because that's exactly what he'd been. 12 years flying F-18 Hornets off aircraft carriers before transitioning to commercial aviation. His salt and pepper hair was regulation perfect, his uniform pressed to knife-edge precision, his bearing that of a man who had never met a situation he couldn't command through sheer force of will. But Jerome Williams wasn't impressed by uniforms or intimidated by authority displays. At 48, the FAA Aviation Safety Inspector had seen too many preventable accidents caused by ego-driven decision-making to be swayed by appearance over substance. His khaki pants and navy polo shirt were chosen for function over flash, his anonymity a weapon more powerful than any badge. Jerome had switched from flying to oversight after watching Pride nearly kill 50 people on a regional jet in Topeka. Never again. That night, lying in a hotel room after a captain's arrogance had almost turned him into a smoking crater, Jerome had realized that the most dangerous thing in aviation wasn't mechanical failure or severe weather. It was pilot ego, unchecked by oversight. The next morning, he'd started the process of switching from flying planes to making sure they were flown safely. Now, staring at Captain Brennan's shocked face as federal authority trumped airline hierarchy, Jerome felt the familiar satisfaction of a trap perfectly sprung. He'd been conducting surprise inspections for over a decade, and experience had taught him that the most dangerous pilots were often the ones who looked most impressive in uniform. Captain Brennan Jerome continued, his voice carrying across the gate area with unmistakable clarity. "You just refused access to a federal aviation safety inspector based on your assumptions about what an inspector should look like. You questioned my credentials without examining them, suggested they might be fraudulent, and attempted to bar me from performing mandatory oversight functions." He paused, letting the magnitude of the violations sink in like acid, eating through metal. All of this occurred in front of multiple witnesses, with video evidence being recorded by passengers who thought they were watching a security screening. Instead, they've documented what appears to be a federal violation that could end your career. First Officer Lisa Rodriguez appeared in the jet bridge doorway, drawn by voices carrying more tension than normal gate operations. What she saw made her stomach clench with dread. Her captain, in full intimidation mode, shoulders squared against someone half his size, using his physical presence like a weapon. Behind Lisa, lead flight attendant David Kim emerged from the aircraft, his experienced eye immediately reading the situation. 12 years of commercial aviation had taught him to recognize the difference between routine passenger conflicts and career-ending incidents. This was definitely the latter. Captain Lisa said quietly, approaching with the diplomatic caution of someone walking through a minefield, "Is everything all right?" Jerome looked at the young first officer with something approaching sympathy. She was about to discover what it felt like to watch a superior officer destroy himself through pride and prejudice, and experience had taught Jerome that collateral damage often extended to entire crews. First Officer Rodriguez Jerome said, reading her name tag, "I'm Inspector Jerome Williams with the FAA. I'm here to conduct a routine ramp check, but your captain seems to believe that federal inspectors should conform to his personal expectations about professional appearance." Lisa felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. FAA inspections were serious business under normal circumstances, but inspections that began with crew confrontations were career-ending catastrophes. She'd heard whispers about other airlines where captains had challenged federal authority and lost everything. David Kim stepped forward with the professional diplomacy that had kept him employed through economic downturns and management changes. Inspector Williams on behalf of Mountain West Airlines. "I want to apologize for any confusion. We absolutely want to cooperate fully with your inspection." Jerome nodded approvingly. "Mr. Kim, I appreciate your professionalism. However, this situation has evolved beyond simple cooperation with inspection procedures. Captain Brennan has violated federal regulations governing inspector access, and that has consequences regardless of subsequent cooperation." Captain Brennan's face had cycled through several colors as the reality of his mistake penetrated his consciousness. The man he'd dismissed as a potential security threat wasn't just a federal inspector. He was a federal inspector that Brennan had publicly humiliated, questioned, and obstructed in front of witnesses and cameras. "Inspector Williams." Brennan said, his voice now carrying the strain of someone trying to stuff an explosion back into its container. "There's been a misunderstanding. Security protocols require verification of credentials, especially in today's environment. I was acting in the interest of passenger safety." Jerome's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to grow colder. "Captain, there was no misunderstanding. You made assumptions based on my appearance and casual attire. You decided that because I didn't look like your preconceived notion of what a federal inspector should be, I must be lying about my credentials and authority." Around them, the gate area had filled with passengers drawn by the confrontation. Phones were recording, business travelers were whispering, and airline employees from other gates were positioning themselves to witness what was clearly becoming a legendary incident. Jerome reached into his satchel and pulled out a small notebook, the same inspection log he'd been using for 15 years of federal oversight. "Captain Brennan, I'm going to offer you one opportunity to demonstrate that you understand the seriousness of the situation and are prepared to comply with federal requirements going forward." He fixed Brennan with a stare that seemed to see right through his uniform and rank to the frightened man underneath. "Are you prepared to immediately and fully cooperate with this safety inspection, including providing complete access to aircraft systems, maintenance records, crew documentation, and any other materials I deem necessary for regulatory compliance?" Brennan nodded quickly, like a drowning man grabbing for a rope. "Yes, absolutely. Full cooperation. Whatever you need." "And do you acknowledge that your initial refusal to allow access was inappropriate and violated federal regulations?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Brennan could continue justifying his actions, maintain his pride, and dig himself deeper into legal trouble. Or he could swallow his ego and accept responsibility for what everyone had witnessed. The silence stretched until Brennan spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I acknowledge that my actions were inappropriate." Jerome made a note in his logbook, his handwriting precise despite the emotional turbulence surrounding them. "Very well, Captain. We'll proceed with the inspection. But I want to be absolutely clear about something." He looked up from his notes with eyes that had seen too many preventable accidents caused by unchecked authority. "This incident will be documented in my report. Your refusal to allow access, your questioning of my credentials, and your eventual compliance will all be noted. The FAA will review this matter and determine what additional consequences, if any, are warranted." Jerome closed his notebook with a sound like a coffin lid closing. In the meantime, I'll be observing not just your aircraft and documentation, but your crew interactions, decision-making processes, and adherence to safety protocols throughout this flight. You'll be conducting operations under the highest level of federal scrutiny." He paused, making sure his next words were clearly understood by everyone within hearing distance. "Captain Brennan, your kingdom in the sky just acquired a very attentive visitor. I trust that's understood." As they walked toward the jet bridge, Jerome could feel the anger radiating from Brennan, like heat from an engine. This wasn't acceptance or understanding. This was forced compliance, driven by fear of consequences. The captain's ego had been publicly crushed, his authority challenged in front of his crew and passengers. In Jerome's experience, that combination of humiliation and forced submission often led to poor decision-making. Pilots who flew angry made mistakes. Captains who felt their authority had been undermined sometimes overcompensated by becoming more rigid and controlling. Jerome had a feeling that the real test of Captain Marcus Brennan's character was just beginning, and early indicators suggested it was going to be a spectacular failure. The kingdom in the sky was about to have a revolution, and the king was already planning his counterattack. The Boeing 737-800 cockpit had never felt smaller. With Jerome Williams methodically examining every document, display, and system, the space designed for efficient two-person operation had become a pressure cooker of scrutiny and barely contained hostility. Captain Brennan sat rigidly in the left seat, his hands gripping his thighs with enough force to leave marks. Every movement, every breath, every decision was being observed and documented by someone who now held the power to end his 28-year career with a single damning report. First Officer Lisa Rodriguez remained at her station trying to continue normal pre-flight procedures while witnessing what felt like a surgical dissection of their entire operation. She'd flown with difficult captains before, but nothing had prepared her for watching federal authority systematically dismantle her captain's composure. Jerome had transformed from diplomatic negotiator into something far more formidable. His inspection technique was surgical. Every maintenance logbook entry scrutinized, every crew certificate examined under harsh overhead light, every operational procedure questioned with the thoroughness of someone who had seen too many accidents caused by small oversights. Captain Jerome said, pointing to an entry in the maintenance logbook, "This air conditioning pack has been deferred for 8 days. That's not maintenance, that's crisis management." The direct confrontation hit harder than technical explanation. Brennan's jaw tightened as he realized Jerome wasn't just reviewing procedures. He was challenging the entire operational philosophy that prioritized schedule over optimal equipment condition. "It's within MEL requirements," Brennan said defensively. "We can legally operate." "Legal isn't the same as smart," Jerome interrupted. "This aircraft has had various systems deferred 6 times in 3 months. That suggests priorities that put schedule ahead of passenger safety." Lisa felt compelled to defend their operation, but Jerome's next question stopped her cold. "First Officer Rodriguez, has Captain Brennan ever dismissed your safety recommendations because they would cause delays or inconvenience?" The question was clearly loaded with implications. Lisa felt trapped between loyalty to her captain and truth-telling to a federal inspector whose report could affect all their careers. Before she could answer, Brennan's voice cut through the cockpit like a blade. "Rodriguez doesn't need to answer hypothetical questions about command decisions she doesn't fully understand." The interruption was perfectly timed to prevent Lisa from responding, but it also demonstrated exactly the kind of intimidation tactic that Jerome suspected was routine. Jerome made a note that carried more weight than its physical size suggested. Captain preventing crew members from answering direct questions about safety culture constitutes obstruction of a federal investigation. He turned to Lisa with eyes that conveyed both authority and protection. "First Officer, you are required to answer questions from federal inspectors." Company hierarchy doesn't supersede federal law. Lisa looked between her captain and the inspector, understanding that her next words could determine the trajectory of her career. Inspector Williams, there have been situations where my safety recommendations were not welcomed. Can you be more specific, Phoenix? Last month, I recommended a go-around due to unstable approach conditions. Captain Brennan overruled me and completed the landing. Afterward, he suggested in my performance review that I needed to trust experienced captains over my own fears. Jerome's pen moved across his notepad with deliberate precision. Each word was becoming evidence in what was clearly a pattern of crew intimidation. David Kim appeared in the cockpit doorway, his professional demeanor barely concealing growing unease. Inspector Williams, we're ready for boarding whenever you complete your inspection. Is there anything specific you need from cabin crew? Jerome looked at the flight attendant with the calculating gaze of someone who understood that crew dynamics often revealed more about safety culture than technical documentation. Mr. Kim, I need to understand how Captain Brennan typically responds to safety concerns raised by cabin crew. The question hung in the cockpit air like a loaded weapon. David felt the familiar pressure of choosing between truth and career security. Captain Brennan maintains clear command authority, David said carefully. He expects adherence to procedures and doesn't encourage unnecessary communication. Has there ever been a situation where cabin crew felt unable to report safety concerns due to fear of the captain's reaction? Before David could answer, Brennan's voice filled the cockpit with barely controlled menace. Kim, we're behind schedule. Finish your cabin preparations. Now. The timing was perfect to prevent David from answering, but the intimidation tactic was so obvious that Jerome actually smiled. Captain, that's the second time you've prevented crew members from answering safety-related questions. Would you like to explain why Brennan's face flushed red as he realized his own behavior was providing evidence of the systematic intimidation Jerome was documenting? I'm ensuring operational efficiency. We have schedules to maintain. At the expense of federal oversight and crew communication, Jerome asked. Because that's exactly the attitude that leads to preventable accidents. As Jerome completed his cockpit inspection, the tension in the confined space had become almost suffocating. Every question had revealed gaps in judgment. Every answer had demonstrated problematic attitudes. Every interaction had shown a command style based on fear rather than respect. Captain Brennan Jerome said as he gathered his materials. I'll be flying with you today, in seat 15D, to observe operational procedures and crew interaction during normal flight operations. Brennan's head snapped up like he'd been struck. You're flying with us. That's correct. My observation of your in-flight operations will be included in my comprehensive inspection report. The implications were staggering. Jerome wouldn't just be reviewing documents and procedures. He'd be watching how Brennan commanded his crew, made decisions under pressure, and responded to the normal challenges of flight operations. After the gate confrontation, it would be like conducting the entire flight under a federal microscope. As Jerome left the cockpit to take his seat in the cabin, Brennan stared at the instrument panel with barely contained rage. The federal inspector had just turned what should have been a routine flight into a comprehensive evaluation of his command performance. Every decision would be scrutinized. Every interaction with his crew would be analyzed. Every response to changing conditions would be documented and judged by someone who had already demonstrated the power to destroy his career. Lisa Rodriguez watched her captain's face cycle through anger, fear, and something approaching desperation. She'd seen Brennan under pressure before, but never like this. Never with his entire professional identity hanging in the balance. Captain, she said quietly, maybe we should review our weather contingencies before departure. Brennan's response came through clenched teeth. Rodriguez, I don't need additional briefings on conditions I've already assessed. But as Flight 2847 prepared for departure, Jerome Williams was settling into seat 15D with his inspection notebook and 15 years of experience reading the warning signs of dangerous command cultures. The flight to Miami was about to become a test that would determine whether Captain Marcus Brennan was fit to command aircraft carrying innocent lives, or whether his kingdom in the sky was built on foundations too rotten to support the weight of genuine responsibility. The revolution had begun, and the king was about to discover that federal authority didn't recognize the divine right of captains. The storm clouds weren't just on the weather radar. They were building in Captain Marcus Brennan's mind as Flight 2D-847 pushed back from Gate B-47. Every routine action felt magnified under federal scrutiny. Every decision weighed against the knowledge that Jerome Williams was sitting in 15D documenting everything for a report that could end his career. Denver ground, Mountain West. 2847, ready to taxi. Lisa Rodriguez called over the radio, her voice maintaining professional calm, despite the tension crackling through the cockpit, like electricity before a lightning strike. Mountain West, 2847 taxi, via Alpha Bravo. Hold short runway, 34 left. Contact tower, 120.35. As they began the taxi to the runway, Brennan's flying had taken on an obsessive precision that bordered on mechanical. Every turn executed with textbook accuracy, every speed restriction followed to the exact knot, every radio call delivered with parade ground military crispness. To an outside observer, it might have looked like exemplary airmanship. To Lisa, it felt like watching a man perform surgery on himself while trying to prove he wasn't bleeding. Mountain West Flight 2847 lifted off runway 34. Left at 8:47 a.m., climbing into crystalline Colorado air that offered visibility for hundreds of miles. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a spectacular departure. But nothing about this flight was normal, and everyone aboard could feel it. The first 30 minutes passed in artificial calm. Brennan flew with robotic precision. Lisa managed her duties with careful diplomacy, and the cabin crew maintained service standards despite the underlying tension. To passengers, it seemed like a routine flight. To Jerome, it felt like the quiet before a Category 5 hurricane. As they leveled at 37,000 feet and turned eastbound toward the developing weather system, the first signs of what was coming began appearing on the aircraft's radar display. What had been isolated afternoon thunderstorms in the morning forecast were developing earlier, stronger, and more extensively than predicted. Captain Lisa said, pointing at the weather display, "The system is building faster than forecast. Those cells are showing level 4 and 5 returns. We should start requesting deviations now." Brennan studied the display with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a move that could determine the game's outcome. The developing weather was significant, but not immediately threatening. They could probably navigate between the largest cells, maybe encounter some turbulence, but nothing that would constitute a real emergency. Unless, of course, the goal was to prove that Jerome Williams' earlier weather concerns had been unfounded. "The routing looks manageable," Brennan said finally. "We'll monitor it closely and deviate if necessary, but I'm not burning extra fuel based on radar returns that may dissipate." Lisa felt her stomach drop as she recognized the dangerous logic. Brennan wasn't making this decision based on pure safety considerations. He was trying to prove the federal inspector wrong about weather assessment, using 189 passengers as unwitting participants in his vindication. Sir, Lisa pressed, "Houston Center is offering early deviations around the system. We could avoid the weather entirely without significant penalties." Brennan turned to look at his first officer with eyes that had gone cold as winter sky. "Rodriguez, are you questioning my weather assessment? Because if you don't trust my judgment, maybe you should request a different captain." The threat was unmistakable. Challenge his decision and risk career retaliation. Lisa had heard whispers about other first officers who had crossed Brennan and found themselves transferred to undesirable routes or given poor performance evaluations. But she was also looking at weather radar that painted a picture of developing severe thunderstorms directly on their path. "Captain, with all due respect, I believe we should accept the deviation. The system is showing more intensity than forecast, and passenger comfort should be our priority." Passenger comfort, Brennan repeated with barely concealed contempt, is not the primary factor in operational decision-making. Professional competence and efficient operations are what matter. We're not running a luxury cruise service. In the cabin, Jerome was documenting what appeared to be a systematic breakdown in crew resource management. The captain wasn't just dismissing safety recommendations. He was actively intimidating the crew member making them. This was exactly the kind of toxic command culture that led to preventable accidents. Houston Center's voice crackled through the headsets. "Mountain West, 2847. I'm showing a line of level 5 and 6 cells developing directly on your route. I can offer immediate clearance for a 40-mile deviation to the south." It was a lifeline offered by professional air traffic controllers who could see the developing danger on their scopes. But Brennan's response revealed the true priority driving his decision-making. "Houston Center, Mountain West, 2847. We'll maintain our current routing. No deviation requested at this time." The controller's response carried barely concealed incredulity. "Mountain West, 2847. Confirm. You're declining the weather deviation. I'm showing extremely hazardous conditions developing on your track. Center, we decline the deviation. We're equipped to handle weather encounters." Lisa Rodriguez stared at her captain in disbelief. He had just refused professional advice from air traffic control, dismissed crew safety recommendations, and committed them to flying into what radar indicated could be life-threatening conditions. All because his pride wouldn't allow him to admit that Jerome Williams might have been right about the weather assessment. In seat 15D, Jerome Williams felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he realized what was happening. Through the cabin windows, he could see the wall of thunderstorms they were approaching. Towering cumulus clouds that looked like the wrath of God, made manifest in water vapor and electrical energy. Any experienced pilot could see the danger, which meant that Captain Brennan was making a conscious choice to fly into hazardous conditions, rather than accept a routing change that might vindicate the inspector's earlier concerns. Jerome opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "Captain deliberately choosing to penetrate severe weather system against ATC recommendations and crew input. Decision appears motivated by personal pride rather than safety considerations. 189 people about to pay the price for one man's ego." As Flight 2T847 continued toward the storm system that would test everyone aboard, Jerome realized he wasn't just documenting regulatory violations anymore. He was potentially documenting the last decisions of a man whose ego had become more important than the lives he was responsible for protecting. The kingdom in the sky was about to collide with the laws of physics, and pride was proving to be a poor shield against the violent forces of nature that respected no earthly authority. In the distance, lightning began to flicker through towering clouds that seemed to reach toward the heavens themselves, as if nature was preparing to render its own verdict on human arrogance and the terrible price of unchecked power. The first real hammer blow hit Flight 22847 like the fist of an angry god. The Boeing 737 didn't just encounter turbulence. It was seized by invisible forces and thrown upward with such violence that several passengers screamed in genuine terror. Then, it dropped like a stone, creating the stomach-lurching sensation of freefall before being caught by another massive updraft. "Jesus Christ," Lisa Rodriguez whispered, then immediately caught herself. Profanity in the cockpit violated company policy, but the words had escaped before her training could stop them. The aircraft had just experienced forces that pushed the boundaries of structural design limits. In the cockpit, multiple warning systems began their electronic chorus of alarm. The overspeed clacker sounded continuously as wind shears alternately accelerated and decelerated the aircraft beyond safe parameters. The altitude alert chimed incessantly as they were thrown thousands of feet above and below their assigned flight level. The master caution light bathed everything in ominous amber. Altitude deviation plus 800 feet. Lisa called out fighting to maintain standard crew coordination as the world disintegrated around them. Now minus 600. Airspeed fluctuating between 170 and 240 knots. Captain Brennan's hands were locked on the control yoke with such force that his knuckles had gone bone white. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cabin air conditioning. The aircraft was no longer flying so much as being hurled through space by forces that exceeded human comprehension or control. "I'm disconnecting the autopilot," Brennan announced through gritted teeth. "Taking manual control." But manual control was a euphemism for what was actually happening. Brennan wasn't controlling the aircraft. He was fighting it, wrestling with control surfaces that seemed determined to tear themselves from his grip as the 737 bucked and rolled through air that had become as violent as a washing machine filled with concrete blocks. In the cabin, the scene had evolved from anxiety into something approaching pandemonium. The elderly woman in 22A was screaming continuously, a high-pitched wail that cut through the roar of stressed engines and groaning airframe. Multiple passengers were vomiting from the violent motion, the smell adding another layer of misery to an already nightmarish situation. "We're going to die," shouted a businessman from 14C, his voice cracking with terror. Oh God, we're crashing," cried a mother clutching her infant in 18B. David Kim was strapped into his jump seat near the forward galley, watching service equipment become deadly projectiles as they broke free from restraints. A coffee pot struck the cabin wall with enough force to dent the aluminum panel. Service carts were sliding back and forth across the aisles, like battering rams, threatening to crush anyone in their path. But the most terrifying aspect wasn't the physical violence. It was the realization that it was completely preventable. They could have been enjoying smooth air and peaceful service 50 miles to the south, but Captain Brennan's ego had condemned them all to this airborne hell. In seat 15D, Inspector Jerome Williams gripped his armrests while documenting what he was witnessing. His inspection notes had evolved from routine observations into what would likely become evidence in a federal investigation and possibly a crash inquiry. Multiple passengers injured. He wrote his handwriting barely legible as the aircraft pitched and rolled. Captain deliberately entered severe weather against crew recommendations and ATC advisories. Conditions exceed aircraft design parameters. This is preventable emergency created by command negligence. The worst part was the knowledge that this wasn't an accident or unexpected encounter. This was the predictable result of a command decision that prioritized personal vindication over passenger safety. Through the chaos, Jerome could hear Captain Brennan's voice over the intercom, strained, but attempting to maintain a facade of control. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some weather as we cross the mountain states. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll have you through this shortly." The announcement was not just inadequate, it was dishonest. This wasn't some weather from mountain effects. This was life-threatening severe weather that they had willingly flown into against all available evidence and professional advice. In the cockpit, Lisa Rodriguez was experiencing her own crisis of conscience. Standard operating procedures required her to support her captain's decisions, but every instinct told her they were in mortal danger due to those same decisions. "Captain," she called over the cacophony of warning systems, "we need to declare an emergency and request immediate vectors out of this weather." Brennan's response came through the physical strain of fighting the controls. "Negative. We can handle this. It's just convective activity." Just convective activity. The phrase would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifyingly disconnected from reality. They were being thrown around like debris in a tornado. Structural stress warnings were activating throughout the aircraft, and passengers were being injured by forces that exceeded anything most commercial travelers would ever experience. The aircraft chose that moment to demonstrate the futility of Brennan's denial. A downdraft caught them with such violence that both pilots were thrown upward against their shoulder harnesses, hard enough to cause bruising. They dropped nearly 1,000 feet in seconds before encountering an updraft that slammed them upward with G-forces that caused Lisa to see stars. "That's it," Lisa announced, reaching for the radio despite Brennan's furious glare. "Houston Center Mountain West, 2847 declaring emergency. We're in severe turbulence with structural stress indications and passenger injuries. Mountain West, 2847 emergency received. Clearing all traffic from your area. State your intentions." Before Lisa could respond, Brennan keyed his own microphone with one hand while fighting the controls with the other. "Center Mountain West, 2847. Cancel emergency declaration. We're experiencing moderate turbulence, but maintaining control." The radio frequency fell silent as the controller processed what he'd just heard. An aircraft declaring and immediately canceling an emergency while showing extreme altitude and speed deviations on radar. "Mountain West, 2847. Confirm you are canceling emergency status while showing severe flight parameter deviations. Affirmative Center. No emergency. Continuing to destination." Lisa Rodriguez stared at her captain in utter disbelief. They were being subjected to forces that threatened the aircraft's structural integrity. Passengers were injured and terrified, and he was telling air traffic control that everything was under control. "Sir," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm, "you are making decisions that could kill everyone on this aircraft. We need assistance, and we need it now." But Brennan was trapped by his own pride in a psychological box with no exit strategy. Acknowledging the severity of their situation would mean admitting that his weather assessment had been catastrophically wrong, that the federal inspector had been right, that his command judgment was fundamentally flawed. His ego simply wouldn't allow that admission, even if the alternative was risking 189 lives. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh managed to call the cockpit on the interphone during a brief moment of slightly calmer air. "Captain, people think we're crashing back here. They're praying and crying and asking if we're going to die. Tell them it's just turbulence," Brennan snapped. "Handle it." But it wasn't just turbulence, and everyone aboard except the captain seemed to understand that. They were trapped in a nightmare of his own making, experiencing forces that could tear the aircraft apart, while the man responsible for their safety continued to prioritize his image over their lives. As Flight 2847 continued its violent passage through the storm system, Jerome Williams made a final note in his inspection logbook. "Captain's decisions appear driven by personal pride rather than operational safety. Systematic failure of command responsibility. If we survive this, recommend immediate revocation of all certifications." Whether anyone would survive to read that report was becoming an increasingly open question. But Jerome was determined that if they didn't survive, the evidence of what had led to their deaths would be preserved for the investigators who would follow. The kingdom in the sky was collapsing under the weight of natural forces that recognized no earthly authority, and the king's pride was the only thing preventing him from saving his subjects. In aviation, as in life, physics always had the final vote, and it was about to render its verdict on Captain Marcus Brennan's fitness for command. For 17 minutes that felt like 17 hours. Flight 2847 was no longer an aircraft. It was a projectile being hurled through three-dimensional violence that defied comprehension. The Boeing 737 bucked, rolled, and dropped through air so turbulent that the laws of controlled flight seemed to have been suspended by some malevolent force. Captain Brennan's fight with the controls had devolved into pure survival. His earlier mechanical precision had been replaced by desperate reactive inputs as he tried to prevent the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable attitude. Sweat poured down his face. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and his voice had taken on the strained quality of a man discovering that 28 years of flying experience meant nothing when faced with forces this extreme. Altitude deviation, plus 1,000 feet. Lisa Rodriguez called out, her voice tight with professional discipline, despite the terror clawing at her throat. Now minus 800. Vertical speed indicating plus 4,000 feet per minute. The numbers were meaningless in the face of what they were experiencing, but calling them out gave her something to focus on other than the growing certainty that they were all about to die because of one man's pride. In the cabin, the scene had transcended mere turbulence and entered the realm of survival horror. Flight attendant Sarah Martinez, strapped into a rear jump seat, watched Robert Martinez, a father of 2 from Denver, strike his head against the window, hard enough to cause bleeding. A middle-aged woman in 21C was clutching her arm and screaming, having suffered what appeared to be a fracture when she was violently thrown against her armrest. The sound was the worst part, a symphony of terror that included screaming passengers, groaning airframes, stressed engines, and the continuous electronic alerts from systems being pushed beyond their design limits. It sounded like the aircraft was tearing itself apart at the molecular level. "We're all going to die," sobbed the elderly woman in 22A, her voice barely audible over the mechanical screaming of an aircraft in distress. David Kim, despite being strapped into his jump seat, was trying to coordinate passenger care through the interphone system. But every time he tried to speak, another violent jolt would throw him against his restraints and interrupt communication. "Captain," he managed to call during a brief moment of slightly calmer air, "we have multiple injuries back here. Robert Martinez in 18B has a serious head trauma. Janet Morrison in 21C has a suspected broken arm. Several people reporting chest pain from the G-forces." Brennan's response came through gritted teeth as he fought another series of violent updrafts. "Understood. Handle it with first aid supplies. We'll be through this soon." But they weren't through it, and everyone aboard was beginning to understand that Captain Brennan's assessment of soon might be fatally optimistic. The storm system seemed to extend forever in every direction, and their violent passage through it was taking a toll on both aircraft and passengers that might not be survivable. In seat 15D, Jerome Williams was experiencing his own battle with physics and mortality. Despite 15 years of aviation experience, the violence of their encounter was beyond anything he'd ever endured. But more concerning than his own discomfort was his growing understanding of what was happening. This wasn't an unexpected weather encounter or a failure of forecasting. This was the predictable result of a deliberate command decision to fly into conditions that every professional indicator had warned against. Captain Brennan had chosen this path, and everyone aboard was paying the price for his ego. Jerome's notebook, despite the violent motion, continued to record evidence. 1347 hours, aircraft experiencing structural stress beyond certification limits. Captain continuing to refuse emergency assistance, despite clear indications of passenger injuries and airframe distress. This is preventable tragedy in progress. The aircraft lurched again, this time with a sickening sideways motion that felt like the beginning of an unrecoverable roll. Several passengers screamed in genuine terror as they felt the horizon tilt beyond anything that commercial aviation should ever experience. In the cockpit, warning systems were painting a Christmas tree of alerts across every panel. The structural stress warning had activated, indicating that the aircraft was being subjected to G-forces beyond its certification limits. Engine overtemperature warnings flickered on and off as the power plants struggled to maintain performance in the violent air. Captain Lisa shouted over the noise, "We're getting structural warnings. The airplane is being stressed beyond design limits." Brennan's response was to continue fighting the controls, as if sheer force of will could overcome the laws of physics. But his technique was deteriorating under stress, his inputs becoming more erratic, as fatigue and adrenaline compromised his motor skills. "I've got it," he grunted, pulling back on the yoke as another downdraft tried to push them toward the earth. "I can handle this." But he couldn't handle it, and everyone aboard was beginning to understand that their survival was now dependent on factors beyond human control. They were passengers on an aircraft being operated by someone whose judgment had been compromised by pride, whose decision-making had been corrupted by ego, and whose commands were now threatening everyone's life. The aircraft bucked again, throwing everyone forward against their restraints, with enough force to cause neck injuries. Overhead bins popped open, spilling luggage and personal items that became additional projectiles in the violent cabin environment. "This is your Captain Brennan's voice," came over the intercom, but now it carried a strain that couldn't be hidden. "We're working through some weather here. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts tight. We'll have you out of this as soon as possible." But everyone aboard could hear what he wasn't saying, that they were trapped in a nightmare of his own making, that their survival depended on the aircraft holding together long enough to escape conditions that should never have been encountered, and that the captain who was supposed to protect them had instead led them into mortal danger. Through the cabin windows, passengers could see lightning crackling through towering clouds that seemed to extend infinitely in every direction. They were trapped inside nature's fury, with no escape except forward through conditions that were testing every rivet, every weld, every component of the aircraft that was their only protection against certain death. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh, strapped into a forward jump seat, closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for the first time since childhood. "Please God, if we survive this, let someone make sure this never happens to anyone else." As the storm continued to rage around them, indifferent to human pride, rank, or federal authority, Flight 2847 was providing everyone aboard with a crash course in mortality hubris and the terrible price of unchecked authority. Physics was rendering its verdict on Captain Marcus Brennan's fitness for command, and the outcome remained very much in doubt. The moment Flight 2847 broke free from the storm's grip felt like resurrection from the dead. One instant they were being murdered by invisible forces, and the next they emerged into air so smooth it felt like floating on glass. The contrast was so dramatic that several passengers actually applauded their relief at simply being alive, overwhelming any anger about what they'd just endured. But the silence that filled the cockpit was anything but relieved. Captain Brennan sat slumped over the controls, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands trembling as adrenaline worked its way out of his system. First Officer Lisa Rodriguez was methodically checking systems and instruments, her movements mechanical, as she processed the magnitude of what they'd just survived. The damage assessment painted a sobering picture. Multiple caution lights indicated systems stressed beyond normal parameters. Interior panels had come loose during the violent encounter. The passenger address system was functioning intermittently, and from the cabin came the sounds of genuine trauma, crying, nervous laughter, hushed conversations about near-death experiences. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your Captain Brennan's voice," came over the intercom, with forced calm that fooled no one. "We've cleared the weather area and are now in smooth air for the remainder of our flight to Miami. We apologize for the rough ride, and we'll have you on the ground shortly." Jerome Williams, still strapped into seat 15D, listened to the announcement with growing incredulity. Rough ride. They had just experienced what could only be described as a near-death encounter with forces that had pushed both aircraft and passengers beyond safe limits, and the captain was characterizing it as a rough ride. David Kim was moving through the cabin conducting what amounted to battlefield triage. The elderly woman in 22A was hyperventilating and showing signs of shock. Robert Martinez, in 18B, needed immediate medical attention. The bleeding had slowed, but he was showing signs of concussion and couldn't remember his own name. At least 7 other passengers were reporting injuries, ranging from whiplash to possible fractures. Captain David's voice came over the interphone with barely controlled urgency. We have multiple injured passengers requiring immediate medical attention. Robert Martinez has a serious head trauma that could result in permanent brain damage without immediate hospital care. I strongly recommend we declare a medical emergency and divert to the nearest suitable airport. Brennan's response was immediate and devastating. Negative. We're continuing to Miami as planned. Handle the injured passengers with onboard medical supplies. We'll have paramedics meet the aircraft on arrival. David Kim stared at the interphone handset in disbelief. They had passengers who potentially needed immediate hospital care, and the captain was refusing to divert. The decision made no sense from a passenger welfare standpoint, but it made perfect sense if viewed through the lens of someone trying to minimize the official consequences of what had just occurred. In the cockpit, Lisa Rodriguez was grappling with her own crisis of conscience. The structural stress warnings had indicated that the aircraft might have sustained damage that warranted immediate inspection. Standard procedures called for landing at the nearest suitable airport and having the airplane examined by qualified maintenance personnel before returning to service. "Captain," she said carefully, "given the forces we experienced, shouldn't we consider having the aircraft inspected before continuing? We exceeded design G-forces for several minutes." Brennan's response carried the sharp edge of someone whose patience had been completely exhausted. "Rodriguez, all critical systems are functioning normally. The aircraft handled the conditions exactly as designed. There's no justification for an unnecessary diversion." The word unnecessary rang through the cockpit like blasphemy. What they'd just experienced hadn't been a normal encounter with weather. It had been a life-threatening ordeal that had pushed everyone and everything aboard to the breaking point. Jerome Williams was documenting every word, every decision, every attempt to minimize what had occurred. The pattern was clear. Captain Brennan was more concerned with avoiding the consequences of his poor judgment than with acknowledging the severity of what had happened. Houston Center, Mountain West, 2847. Brennan called over the radio with carefully modulated professionalism. "We've cleared the weather area and are proceeding normally to Miami. All systems normal, no assistance required." The controller's response carried a note of professional concern. "Mountain West, 2847. We observed extreme altitude and speed deviations during your weather encounter. Are you certain you require no assistance?" "Affirmative, Center. Normal operations resumed. No assistance required." Lisa Rodriguez felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized what was happening. Captain Brennan was creating an official record that contradicted what everyone aboard the aircraft had just experienced. This wasn't just poor judgment. It was potential falsification of operational reports. In the cabin, Jerome was watching David Kim coordinate care for injured passengers while dealing with his own moral crisis. The lead flight attendant clearly understood that multiple passengers needed hospital-level medical attention, but he was being ordered to manage everything with basic first aid supplies. Robert Martinez was showing classic signs of serious concussion confusion, memory loss, unequal pupil dilation that could indicate brain swelling. The elderly woman in 22A was experiencing chest pains that could indicate cardiac emergency triggered by the extreme stress. Several other passengers were reporting neck and back injuries, consistent with whiplash from forces that had exceeded anything commercial aviation should subject passengers to. "Inspector Williams," David said quietly as he paused beside Jerome's seat. "I've documented every injury and every request for medical diversion. But sir, I'm genuinely worried that Robert Martinez could die if he doesn't get immediate brain imaging. We're still 90 minutes from Miami. and I don't think he can wait that long. Jerome looked at the flight attendant with eyes that had seen too many preventable tragedies caused by commanders who prioritized image over responsibility. Mr. Kim continued documenting everything. Every conversation with the cockpit, every passenger deterioration, every medical situation. This will all be part of the federal investigation. The weight of those words settled over both men. They were trapped in a metal tube at 37,000 feet, with potentially seriously injured passengers, a captain who was refusing appropriate medical response, and no way to override command decisions that appeared to be driven by self-preservation rather than passenger welfare. Back in the cockpit, Brennan was working methodically to construct a narrative that would minimize his legal exposure. He pulled out the aircraft logbook and began making entries that characterized the weather encounter as moderate turbulence and described all aircraft systems as normal following the incident. Captain Lisa said watching him write that entry doesn't accurately reflect the conditions we experienced. We had structural stress warnings, multiple system alerts, and forces that exceeded design parameters. Brennan looked at his first officer with eyes that had gone completely flat and dangerous. Rodriguez, my logbook entries reflect my assessment as pilot in command. If you disagree with my operational decisions, you're welcome to file your own report through appropriate channels. The threat was unmistakable, but it was also a trap. Any report Lisa filed contradicting Brennan's official narrative would likely result in retaliation, poor performance evaluations, and potential career destruction. But her signature would also be required to validate the captain's logbook entries, making her complicit in what appeared to be deliberate falsification of safety records. "Sir," she said quietly, "I cannot in good conscience sign off on entries that misrepresent the severity of what we experienced. Those are federal documents, and accuracy is required by law." Brennan's voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "First Officer Rodriguez, your signature on required documents is not optional. Your future in commercial aviation depends on your ability to support your captain and your company. Do I make myself clear?" The threat was now explicit. Sign the false documents or face career destruction. Lisa felt the walls of the cockpit closing in as she realized she was being asked to choose between her integrity and her livelihood. Jerome Williams, unaware of the specific conversation occurring in the cockpit, but sensing the toxic atmosphere, was documenting a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond poor weather judgment into witness intimidation and potential federal fraud. As Flight 22847 continued toward Miami in now smooth air, the real turbulence was just beginning. Captain Brennan's attempts to cover up his catastrophic decision-making were creating additional federal violations that would compound his original errors. But more immediately, Robert Martinez and other injured passengers throughout the cabin were suffering the consequences of his refusal to acknowledge that their medical needs superseded his desire to avoid official scrutiny. The kingdom in the sky had become a prison where the king's subjects were suffering for his sins, and there was no appeal from his absolute authority until they reached the ground, assuming they all survived that long. Miami International Airport appeared through the cockpit windows like a mirage of salvation, its runways stretching across the Florida landscape in geometric precision that promised an end to the nightmare that Flight 2847 had become. But as Captain Brennan lined up for final approach to runway 8R, the real crisis was just beginning. The landing was firm, harder than necessary, as Brennan's hands still carried the tremor of someone whose nervous system hadn't fully recovered from the stress of the storm encounter. The Boeing 737 touched down with enough force to cause several passengers to gasp, a final reminder that their captain's performance remained compromised by the ordeal he had chosen to put them through. As they taxied toward the gate, Jerome Williams was putting the finishing touches on inspection notes that had evolved into evidence of systematic safety violations, crew intimidation, and potential federal fraud. What had begun as routine oversight had become documentation of command failure on multiple levels. But the moment the engine spooled down and the aircraft reached the gate, Jerome was out of his seat and moving toward the cockpit with federal authority and 15 years of investigative experience behind every step. Captain Brennan Jerome announced as he entered the flight deck, "This aircraft is now under federal investigation. I'm securing the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder to prevent the normal overwrite cycle. Nothing on this aircraft is to be altered, moved, or tampered with until FAA technical personnel can examine the evidence." Brennan looked up from his post-flight checklist with eyes that showed the strain of the past 4 hours, but also a desperate hope that he could still control the narrative. "Inspector Williams, I don't understand what investigation you're referring to. We completed a normal flight with weather encountered en route. The disconnect between what Jerome had observed and what Brennan was claiming created a moment of almost surreal silence." Lisa Rodriguez watched the exchange with fascination and horror, realizing that her captain was doubling down on his false narrative, even in the face of federal oversight. Captain Jerome said with the patience of someone explaining fundamental concepts to a willfully ignorant child, "I observed. You refuse multiple weather deviations against crew recommendations, deliberately fly into severe thunderstorms, deny emergency assistance despite structural stress, warnings and passenger injuries, refuse medical diversion for seriously injured passengers, and attempt to falsify official flight records. None of that constitutes normal operations." Before Brennan could respond, the aircraft filled with paramedics and airport medical personnel. David Kim had radioed ahead despite his captain's objections, and Miami International's emergency response team was treating this as a serious medical incident, regardless of what the flight crew claimed. "We have multiple trauma cases requiring immediate hospital transport," the lead paramedic announced as his team began moving through the cabin with professional efficiency. "I understand you have a passenger with potential traumatic brain injury." Jerome's federal authority overruled any objection Brennan might have made. "Paramedics, you have complete access to all passengers. Captain Brennan, you will not interfere with medical care or emergency response procedures." The cabin became a triage center as medical professionals evaluated passengers who had been injured during the storm encounter. Robert Martinez was being prepared for immediate transport to Jackson Memorial Hospital. His condition had deteriorated during the flight, and doctors were concerned about brain swelling that could result in permanent cognitive damage. The elderly woman from 22A was being evaluated for stress-induced cardiac issues that required immediate monitoring. Lisa Rodriguez watched the medical response with a mixture of vindication and guilt. These injuries were the direct result of Captain Brennan's decision to fly into avoidable severe weather, but she felt partially responsible for not challenging him more forcefully when she'd had the chance. Jerome approached her as she gathered her flight materials. "First Officer Rodriguez, I need you to understand something. Your cooperation with this investigation could determine whether changes are made that prevent similar incidents or whether this pattern continues until someone dies." Lisa looked around the cockpit at the captain, who had threatened her career for speaking up about safety, at the federal inspector, who represented her only chance for justice at the aftermath of a flight that could have killed everyone aboard. "Inspector Williams," she said quietly, "I have a lot to tell you, but I need to know that speaking up won't destroy my career the way it has for others who've challenged this captain." Jerome's response carried the weight of federal protection. First Officer witness intimidation is a federal crime. Your testimony will be protected, and any retaliation will result in additional charges against those responsible. The FAA doesn't abandon people who speak up for safety. Meanwhile, David Kim was coordinating with medical personnel while documenting every aspect of the passenger care crisis that Brennan had created through his refusal to divert. His training had emphasized the critical importance of accurate record-keeping during medical emergencies. and he understood that his documentation would be crucial evidence of command negligence. Inspector Williams, David said as Jerome moved through the cabin, I need to report that Captain Brennan explicitly refused my requests for medical emergency diversion, despite multiple passengers requiring immediate hospital care. Robert Martinez was showing signs of traumatic brain injury for over an hour, and the captain ordered me to handle everything with aspirin and ice packs. Jerome nodded grimly. Another piece of evidence in what was becoming an overwhelming case of negligent command decisions that had prioritized personal image over passenger welfare. But the most shocking discovery came when Jerome reviewed the aircraft's maintenance logbook. Captain Brennan had made entries that characterized the severe weather encounter as light to moderate turbulence and claimed that all systems functioned normally throughout the flight. The falsification was so blatant that Jerome actually photographed the entries with his phone before calling FAA headquarters. Sarah, it's Jerome. I need an immediate evidence preservation team at Miami International. Captain Brennan has falsified federal maintenance records in addition to everything else. We're looking at potential criminal fraud charges. As Jerome moved back toward the cockpit, he found Captain Brennan gathering his flight bag and preparing to leave, apparently under the assumption that he could simply walk away from what had occurred. Captain Jerome said with unmistakable federal authority, "You are not leaving this airport until you've provided a formal statement about today's flight operations. You are also prohibited from discussing this incident with Mountain West Airlines management crew schedulers or union representatives until this investigation is complete." Brennan's head snapped up his face, flushing with anger and desperation. Inspector Williams, I don't know what kind of vendetta you think you're pursuing, but I've done nothing wrong. I flew a challenging flight through difficult weather and brought everyone home safely. Jerome looked at the man who had nearly killed 189 people, rather than admit he'd made a mistake, who had intimidated his crew into silence, who was still trying to characterize a near catastrophe as routine airmanship. Captain Brennan, Jerome said, with the finality of a judge rendering verdict, your safely includes multiple passenger injuries, aircraft structural stress beyond design limits, denial of appropriate medical care, intimidation of crew members, and falsification of official records. That's not airmanship. That's criminal negligence. As medical personnel wheeled Robert Martinez toward a waiting ambulance, the father of two now unconscious and fighting for his cognitive future, Captain Brennan finally began to see the consequences of his decisions, written in human suffering. That man may never fully recover because you refused a 15-minute medical diversion. Jerome continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. His children may grow up with a father who can't remember their names because your pride was more important than his brain. Around them, the organized chaos of emergency response continued. Multiple injured passengers were being transported to area hospitals. Airport security was establishing a federal investigation perimeter. The crew members who had tried to uphold their professional responsibilities, despite their captain's poor judgment, were beginning to give statements that would form the foundation of what promised to be a career-ending enforcement action. Chief Pilot Robert Hammond chose that moment to arrive, having been notified by the airline's operations center that one of their aircraft was involved in a federal investigation. Hammond's immediate instinct was to protect the company's interests and his captain's career. Inspector Williams, Hammond said, approaching with the corporate authority of someone accustomed to managing federal oversight. I understand there's been some kind of incident. Captain Brennan is one of our most experienced pilots. I'm sure we can resolve any misunderstandings. Jerome looked at the chief pilot with eyes that had seen too many institutional cover-ups. Mr. Hammond, there's no misunderstanding. Your captain deliberately flew into severe weather against crew recommendations, and air traffic control advisories refused emergency assistance. Despite passenger injuries, denied medical diversion for critically injured passengers, and falsified official records. The only question now is whether you were aware of his pattern of dangerous behavior. Hammond's face went pale as he realized this wasn't a minor regulatory issue that could be managed through corporate relationships. This was a federal investigation with criminal implications that could destroy careers and result in prison sentences. As the investigation team began arriving and the scope of the evidence became clear, Captain Marcus Brennan finally understood that his kingdom in the sky hadn't just fallen. It had been revealed as a house of cards built on intimidation, enabled by institutional cowardice, and ultimately toppled by the courage of those who had finally found their voices. The revolution was complete, and there would be no restoration of the old order. The conference room at Miami International Airport's administrative offices had been hastily converted into an interview center as Jerome Williams began the systematic process of documenting what had occurred aboard Flight 2847. By evening, 3 separate conversations were taking place that would seal Captain Marcus Brennan's fate and potentially transform an entire airline safety culture. First Officer Lisa Rodriguez sat across from Jerome with the posture of someone who had finally decided that truth was worth more than career security. For 6 years, she had navigated commercial aviation's complex hierarchy by being competent, diplomatic, and careful never to challenge authority too directly. But what she had witnessed during the storm encounter had shattered her ability to remain silent. Inspector Williams' Lisa began, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. What happened today wasn't an isolated incident. Captain Brennan has a systematic pattern of intimidating crew members who question his decisions, and Mountain West management knows about it. Jerome made notes as Lisa described a Phoenix incident from 3 months earlier, where Brennan had dismissed her concerns about an unstable approach and then written a performance evaluation that questioned her ability to work effectively in a crew environment airline code for being difficult to work with. He told me explicitly that real first officers trust their captain's experience over their own fears. Lisa continued, "When I tried to explain that questioning unstable approaches is required by our training, he said that women pilots were too emotional for critical decision-making situations." But the most damning testimony concerned the weather decisions that had nearly killed everyone aboard. Captain Brennan didn't refuse the deviation because of operational necessity. Lisa said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the implications of her words. He specifically stated that he wouldn't alter course based on what he called some inspector's paranoia about a few clouds. He made it clear that proving you wrong was more important than passenger safety or crew recommendations. Jerome's pen stopped moving as the full meaning sank in. This wasn't just poor judgment or inadequate weather assessment. This was a deliberate decision to endanger lives in order to vindicate personal pride against federal oversight. In a separate conference room, David Kim was providing his own account of systematic crew intimidation and the medical emergency that Brennan had refused to acknowledge. 12 years of flight attendant experience had taught David to document everything, and his records painted a disturbing picture of command culture that prioritized hierarchy over human welfare. "Inspector, I've worked with demanding captains, perfectionists, even difficult personalities," David explained. "But Captain Brennan is the only pilot I've ever flown with who actively discourages safety communication and retaliates against crew members who report problems." David pulled out his personal logbook. Flight attendants weren't required to maintain such records, but his commitment to professionalism had created a detailed chronicle of concerning incidents. September 15th, Denver to Phoenix. "Captain refused to return to gate for mechanical issue," I reported. "Told me cabin crew should focus on service, not second-guessing maintenance professionals." Passenger later found loose seat that could have caused injury during turbulence. October 2nd, Chicago to Miami. Captain made inappropriate comments about female first officers' competence during crew briefing. Said women pilots were too emotional for command positions and needed male oversight. October 8th, Phoenix to Denver. Captain refused passenger request for medical diversion, despite clear heart attack symptoms. Passenger was hospitalized immediately upon landing and told doctors that earlier medical attention could have prevented permanent heart damage. Each incident by itself might have been explained as personality conflict or different operational philosophies. Together, they revealed a pattern of command behavior that systematically undermined the collaborative safety culture that modern aviation required. But it was David's account of the medical emergency denial that proved most damaging to any defense Brennan might attempt. I made 3 separate requests for medical diversion during the 90 minutes following our weather encounter, David testified. Robert Martinez was showing clear signs of traumatic brain injury, confusion, memory loss, unequal pupil dilation that indicated possible brain swelling. Captain Brennan's response was essentially the same. Each time handle it with onboard supplies. We're continuing to Miami, regardless of passenger condition. David's voice tightened with professional frustration as he continued. Inspector, I'm trained to recognize medical emergencies. I was watching a man potentially die while being told to treat serious brain trauma with aspirin and ice packs. When I explained that Mr. Martinez might suffer permanent cognitive damage without immediate hospital care, Captain Brennan said that passengers assume risks when they choose to fly. The most powerful testimony, however, came from an unexpected source. Thomas Chen, the former first officer whose career had been destroyed for challenging Brennan years earlier, had heard about the investigation through the airline pilot network and volunteered to provide historical context that revealed the true scope of the problem. Thomas appeared via video conference from his small flight school in Arizona, his face showing the wear of someone who had paid a heavy price for speaking truth to power. But his voice carried the moral authority of vindication, finally within reach. Inspector Williams Thomas began what happened on Flight 2847 is exactly what I tried to report 6 years ago. Captain Brennan doesn't just make poor decisions. He systematically destroys anyone who questions those decisions, and Mountain West management enables him. Thomas described the Denver incident that had ended his airline career, an altitude bust that had resulted in a near collision with another aircraft. When he'd filed the required safety report, Brennan had accused him of disloyalty, incompetence, and failure to support command authority. Within 2 weeks, I was transferred to reserve status at the most undesirable base, Thomas continued. My performance evaluations suddenly became needs improvement across every category. Training captains were told I had attitude problems. Chief Pilot Hammond personally called me into his office and suggested I might be happier at a regional carrier. The systematic retaliation had continued until Thomas felt he had no choice but to resign from commercial aviation entirely. His departure had sent a clear message to other crew members: challenge Captain Brennan and lose your career. The most frustrating part, Thomas said, his voice carrying years of suppressed anger, was that Mountain West management knew exactly what was happening. I filed formal complaints with the chief pilot with human resources with the company's anonymous safety reporting system. Every report was dismissed as personality conflict or failure to adapt to command structure. Jerome was documenting evidence of institutional enablement that extended far beyond one pilot's misconduct. The airline had not only failed to address Brennan's behavior, they had actively protected him by silencing and removing those who reported problems. Mr. Chen Jerome said, "Are you willing to testify formally about these incidents and provide documentation of the retaliation you experienced?" Thomas's response carried the weight of someone who had waited years for this moment. Inspector Williams, I've kept every document, every email, every performance evaluation from my time at Mountain West. I've been waiting 6 years for someone with the authority to listen. Captain Brennan's behavior on Flight 2847 was inevitable. The only surprise is that it took this long for someone to die. The reference to death was premature but prophetic. As the interviews continued, news arrived from Jackson Memorial Hospital that Robert Martinez had been placed in a medically induced coma due to brain swelling that could have been prevented with earlier medical intervention. His prognosis remained uncertain, but doctors indicated that the delay in treatment had significantly increased the risk of permanent cognitive impairment. As Jerome compiled witness statements, medical reports, and historical documentation, the scope of Captain Marcus Brennan's violations became overwhelming. But more than individual misconduct, the evidence revealed systematic institutional failure that had endangered passengers for years while protecting a dangerous pilot through intimidation and retaliation. The witnesses had finally spoken, and their voices would echo through commercial aviation for decades to come, forcing reforms that would prevent similar tragedies and protect those brave enough to speak up for safety over hierarchy. The kingdom in the sky hadn't just fallen. It had been revealed as a corrupt system that would now be rebuilt on foundations of accountability, transparency, and genuine safety culture, rather than fear and intimidation. The war room at the FAA's Miami Flight Standards District Office looked like the headquarters of a major criminal investigation. Charts covered every wall, witness statements were organized in chronological order, and technical evidence filled multiple bankers' boxes as Jerome Williams briefed his supervisor on what had become one of the most comprehensive pilot misconduct cases in recent aviation history. The evidence extends far beyond Flight 2847. Jerome explained to Principal Inspector Sarah Chen, whose 20 years of aviation safety investigations had prepared her for serious cases, but not necessarily for the systematic failures they'd uncovered. We're looking at a pattern of dangerous command behavior that was enabled by corporate negligence for over 6 years. Jerome moved to a timeline chart that stretched across an entire wall. Starting with Thomas Chen's allegations in 2018, we can trace a consistent pattern of crew intimidation, safety report, suppression, and retaliation against anyone who challenged Brennan's authority. Mountain West Airlines didn't just ignore these reports. They actively punished the people making them. Sarah Chen studied the documentation with the methodical attention of someone who understood that their findings would reshape how airlines managed crew relations and safety culture. Jerome: this suggests institutional liability that could result in criminal charges against airline management. We need to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office immediately. The investigation had grown beyond individual pilot violations into corporate criminality. Mountain West Airlines hadn't just failed to address Brennan's behavior. They had actively enabled it through systematic suppression of crew complaints and retaliation against whistleblowers. Here's what we found in the corporate files. Jerome continued opening a folder that contained internal communications obtained through federal subpoena. Chief Pilot Robert Hammond was personally aware of at least 8 formal complaints against Brennan over the past 4 years. His response was consistently to transfer complainants to less desirable assignments or suggest they needed additional training in crew cooperation. The documents painted a picture of institutional corruption that prioritized protecting senior captains over passenger safety. Human resources records showed that crew members who filed reports against Brennan were systematically marginalized through poor performance evaluations, undesirable scheduling, and blocked advancement opportunities. The Phoenix incident from 2019 is particularly damaging, Jerome noted, pulling out another file. First Officer Jennifer Walsh reported that Brennan had made an unstable approach in violation of company procedures and made inappropriate comments about women pilots. Within a week, she was transferred to reserve status and given a performance review that questioned her emotional stability under pressure. Sarah Chen's expression darkened as she read the personnel files. This is textbook witness intimidation and gender discrimination. They didn't just ignore safety complaints. They punished the people making them and used discriminatory language to justify it. The technical evidence was equally damning. The cockpit voice recorder from Flight 2847 had captured not just Brennan's refusal to accept safety recommendations, but his explicit threats against crew members who might report his decisions. The audio was played in the secure conference room, and Brennan's voice filled the space with chilling clarity. "Your future in this industry depends on your ability to be a team player, Rodriguez. Anyone who files contradictory reports will find their career advancement opportunities severely limited." But perhaps the most shocking discovery came from the flight data recorder analysis. FAA technical specialists had found that Flight 2847 had experienced G-forces that exceeded the Boeing 737's design limitations for sustained periods, forces that could have caused structural failure and loss of the aircraft. The peak G-force readings show plus 3.4 and minus 2.1 Gs for over 6 minutes, explained Technical Inspector Mike Torres, whose structural analysis painted a picture of an aircraft pushed beyond safe operational limits. According to Boeing's structural engineers report, Flight 2847 came within 0.2 G of catastrophic wing failure. "We're talking about forces that could have torn the aircraft apart." Jerome nodded grimly. Instead, Captain Brennan told air traffic control that conditions were moderate and declined all offers of assistance. Then he falsified the maintenance logbook to show light turbulence and normal operations. The investigation team was building a case that demonstrated willful endangerment of passengers, systematic crew intimidation, corporate enabling of dangerous behavior, and federal fraud through falsification of official records. As evidence mounted, it became clear that Flight 2847 represented the inevitable culmination of years of unchecked authority and institutional cowardice. The only reason 189 people had survived was luck and the structural integrity of a well-designed aircraft, not Captain Brennan's skill or judgment. The case took another disturbing turn when Dr. Sarah Martinez, the emergency room physician treating Flight 2847's passengers, provided her medical assessment of the injuries and the consequences of delayed treatment. Inspector Williams, Dr. Martinez explained during her formal interview, Robert Martinez's traumatic brain injury could have been prevented with immediate medical intervention. The delay in treatment allowed brain swelling to progress to the point where we had to induce a coma. Even if he recovers, he may never regain full cognitive function. She pulled out medical charts that detailed the extent of passenger injuries. In my professional opinion, immediate medical diversion would have been not just appropriate, but life-saving. We're dealing with injuries typically seen in car accidents or aircraft emergencies, the kind of trauma that requires immediate hospital care, not first aid. Sarah Chen was reviewing witness statements when her phone rang with news that would add another dimension to the investigation. Jerome, that was the U.S. Attorney's Office. They want to discuss potential criminal charges for reckless endangerment, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct federal safety oversight. The implications were staggering. This was no longer just about regulatory violations and career consequences. Federal prosecutors were considering criminal charges that could result in prison sentences for both Brennan and Mountain West management. Meanwhile, the aviation industry was reacting to news of the investigation with a mixture of shock and recognition. Pilot forums were filled with discussions about similar experiences with intimidating captains. Flight attendant associations were encouraging members to come forward with their own stories of suppressed safety reporting. The pilot union was facing its own crisis as members demanded to know why they had protected Brennan, despite multiple complaints about his behavior. Union Representative David Walsh was fielding increasingly hostile calls from pilots who felt betrayed by the organization's failure to address dangerous command cultures. "How did we protect someone who was endangering our profession?" demanded Captain Maria Santos during an emergency union meeting. "Every pilot who stayed silent is partially responsible for what happened to those passengers." The union's internal investigation revealed that multiple pilots had informally complained about Brennan's intimidation tactics, but none had been willing to file formal grievances due to fear of retaliation. The culture of silence that protected bad actors had extended beyond Mountain West Airlines into the very organization designed to protect pilot interests. As news of the investigation spread through aviation circles, other crew members began coming forward with additional incidents that hadn't been officially reported. Flight attendant Rebecca Torres contacted Jerome directly with evidence of the Denver incident, where Brennan had refused to return to the gate for a passenger medical emergency, resulting in a death that occurred minutes after landing. The passenger was having chest pains and difficulty breathing. Rebecca testified, "I requested medical diversion twice, and Captain Brennan told me that people have panic attacks on airplanes all the time. He said we weren't going to inconvenience 150 passengers for one person's anxiety issues." The passenger had died of a massive heart attack in the jetway, potentially preventable if immediate medical attention had been available. The incident had been classified as a natural death, with no investigation of the delay in medical care. Jerome realized they weren't just dealing with reckless endangerment anymore. They were potentially dealing with criminally negligent homicide. The pattern of medical diversion refusals revealed a systematic disregard for passenger welfare that had already resulted in at least one death and multiple serious injuries. The evidence files were growing beyond what Jerome's team could manage internally. Federal prosecutors were now involved, and the FBI's white-collar crime unit was examining potential charges of conspiracy fraud and reckless endangerment against both Brennan and Mountain West management. "This case will reshape aviation safety oversight," Sarah Chen told the assembled investigation team. "But more importantly, it will save lives by demonstrating that toxic command cultures have consequences that extend far beyond individual careers." As Jerome prepared his preliminary findings for federal prosecutors, he reflected on how a routine inspection had uncovered institutional failures that threatened the foundation of aviation safety. The Flight 22847 incident had been prevented from becoming a mass casualty event only by chance and aircraft engineering, not by the professionals responsible for protecting passenger lives. The investigation had revealed that Mountain West Airlines' corporate culture was rotten from top to bottom. CEO Patricia Kellerman was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of criminal investigations. The company's stock price had plummeted by 40% as investors recognized the magnitude of potential legal liability. But now those failures would be exposed, prosecuted, and used to reform an industry that had grown too comfortable with hierarchy over safety. The revolution in the sky was spreading beyond one aircraft to encompass the entire system that had enabled such dangerous behavior. Captain Marcus Brennan's kingdom hadn't just fallen. It had revealed the institutional rot that would now be rebuilt on principles of accountability, transparency, and genuine safety culture, rather than fear and intimidation. The federal hearing room in Atlanta's FAA regional office felt like a courtroom where the death penalty was on the table, which in aviation terms it was. Captain Marcus Brennan's professional execution was about to be carried out with the methodical precision that federal justice demanded. Hearing officer Elizabeth Morrison had presided over hundreds of enforcement actions, but few cases had arrived at her bench with evidence this overwhelming or implications this far-reaching. The Flight 22847 incident had exposed systemic failures that threatened to undermine public confidence in commercial aviation safety. Brennan sat at the respondents' table with his union representative and two corporate attorneys, but their presence felt more like a funeral arrangement than a defense strategy. The evidence against him was so comprehensive that the hearing had become less about determining guilt than about documenting the scope of his violations for the permanent record. "Captain Brennan," Hearing Officer Morrison began, "you stand accused of multiple violations of federal aviation regulations that individually could result in certificate revocation. Collectively, they paint a picture of systematic unfitness for the responsibilities of airline transport pilot certification." Jerome Williams took the stand as the primary government witness, and his testimony painted a methodical picture of command failure that extended far beyond poor judgment into criminal negligence. Hearing Officer Morrison, my investigation revealed a pattern of decision-making that consistently prioritized personal pride over passenger safety schedule, adherence over crew recommendations, and image management over honest reporting of safety incidents. Jerome's presentation of evidence was devastating in its completeness. The cockpit voice recorder played Brennan's explicit threats against crew members. Flight data recorder analysis showed the aircraft being subjected to forces that exceeded design limitations. Medical testimony documented passenger injuries that could have been prevented through appropriate emergency response. But the most damaging evidence came from the pattern testimony, the systematic record of crew intimidation and retaliation that had enabled Brennan's behavior for years. First Officer Lisa Rodriguez testified with the moral authority of someone who had risked everything to speak truth. Captain Brennan explicitly told me that my career advancement depended on not filing reports that contradicted his assessments. He made it clear that crew members who challenged his authority would face professional destruction. David Kim's testimony about the medical emergency denial was particularly powerful. We had Robert Martinez showing clear signs of traumatic brain injury, and Captain Brennan refused medical diversion 3 separate times. His exact words were, "Passengers assume risks when they choose to fly. We're not running an ambulance service." Thomas Chen appeared via video conference from Arizona, his presence representing the vindication of every crew member who had been silenced for speaking up about safety. Captain Brennan didn't just make poor decisions. He systematically destroyed the careers of anyone who questioned those decisions. The Flight 22847 incident was inevitable, given the culture of intimidation he created. Chief Pilot Robert Hammond was called to testify about the airline's response to crew complaints, and his performance under questioning revealed the institutional enabling that had protected Brennan for years. Mr. Hammond, the FAA attorney, pressed you received 8 formal complaints about Captain Brennan's intimidation of crew members over 4 years. What action did you take? Hammond's response was a masterclass in corporate deflection. Captain Brennan was one of our most experienced pilots. We addressed personality conflicts through additional crew resource management training and reassignments when necessary. By reassignments, you mean transferring the complainants to less desirable positions, while Captain Brennan remained in his command role. We made personnel decisions based on operational needs and crew compatibility. Mr. Hammond, are you aware that Thomas Chen resigned from commercial aviation entirely after filing safety reports about Captain Brennan? Hammond's pause was telling. Mr. Chen's departure was his personal choice. We don't comment on former employees. But the hearing officer had already seen the documentation showing how Chen had been systematically retaliated against until resignation became his only option. When Captain Brennan finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealed a man still incapable of accepting responsibility for his actions. He characterized the gate confrontation as appropriate security vigilance, the weather decision as experienced pilot judgment under challenging conditions, and the crew conflicts as normal exercise of command authority. I have 28 years of safe flying. Brennan testified, his voice carrying the desperation of someone whose entire identity was being dismantled. I brought that aircraft and 189 souls home safely, despite encountering weather that exceeded forecast conditions. I don't understand how exercising command authority and maintaining operational discipline has become a violation. Hearing Officer Morrison leaned forward with an expression that combined professional disappointment with genuine incredulity. Captain Brennan, do you acknowledge that Robert Martinez may suffer permanent brain damage as a direct result of your refusal to seek immediate medical care? Brennan's answer revealed everything about his fundamental unfitness for command. Passengers assume inherent risks when they choose commercial aviation. My responsibility is to operate the aircraft safely and efficiently according to company procedures and federal regulations, not to provide medical services or avoid every possible source of discomfort. The hearing room erupted in quiet murmurs as the full implications of his statement penetrated. Even his own attorneys looked stunned by his complete inability to acknowledge that passenger welfare should be the paramount concern of every professional pilot. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened, and a woman in her 30s entered quietly. She approached the government attorney and whispered something that caused him to immediately request a brief recess. During the break, Jerome learned that the woman was Maria Martinez Roberts' wife, who had come to witness the proceedings against the man whose decisions had potentially destroyed her husband's cognitive abilities forever. When the hearing resumed, the government attorney made an unprecedented request. Hearing Officer Morrison, Mrs. Martinez has asked to provide a victim impact statement about the consequences of Captain Brennan's decisions. Morrison considered the request carefully. While unusual in regulatory proceedings, the severity of the case and the potential criminal implications warranted exceptional measures. Mrs. Martinez, you may proceed. Maria Martinez approached the witness stand with the dignity of someone who had endured unimaginable loss. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of a shattered family. Captain Brennan, my husband Robert went to work that morning as a software engineer and father who helped our twins with their homework every night. He boarded your flight as a passenger who trusted you with his life and his future. She paused, looking directly at Brennan with eyes that seemed to see through his uniform to the man underneath. Because you refused a 15-minute medical diversion, my children may grow up with a father who doesn't remember their names. Because your pride was more important than his brain injury. I may lose the man I married to cognitive impairment that could have been prevented. The silence in the hearing room was absolute. Brennan stared at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. I'm not here for revenge, Maria continued. I'm here so that you understand that your decisions have consequences that extend far beyond your career. Real people, real families, real lives destroyed by your choices. When she finished, even the court reporter was wiping away tears. Jerome Williams watched from the witness section as Captain Marcus Brennan's aviation career committed suicide through testimony that demonstrated not just poor judgment, but fundamental character flaws that made him unfit for any position of responsibility over human lives. The evidence was overwhelming, the violations clear, and the human cost undeniable. Captain Brennan's kingdom in the sky was about to fall, completely brought down not by external enemies, but by the accumulated weight of his own moral failures. Hearing Officer Elizabeth Morrison returned to the formal chamber with the weight of federal authority and 30 years of aviation experience behind her decision. The hearing room had filled during the recess. Word had spread throughout the aviation community that a landmark enforcement action was about to be rendered, and the outcome would send ripples throughout the industry. Captain Marcus Brennan sat rigidly at the respondent's table, his hands folded so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Beside him, his union representative and corporate attorneys maintained the professional composure that came with knowing their case was lost before the first witness had testified. Inspector Jerome Williams remained in the witness section, his notebook closed after 6 months of documenting one of the most comprehensive safety violations he'd encountered in 15 years of federal oversight. The evidence spoke for itself, but the broader implications would extend far beyond one pilot's misconduct. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, Hearing Officer Morrison began this. Hearing has revealed not just individual violations of federal aviation regulations, but systematic failures of character judgment and institutional oversight that threatened the lives of innocent passengers and corrupted the professional culture that aviation safety depends upon. She looked directly at Captain Brennan, her expression reflecting the gravity of what was about to unfold. Captain Brennan, your actions on October 12th demonstrate a fundamental unfitness for the responsibilities of airline transport pilot certification. You willfully disregarded crew safety recommendations, deliberately flew into hazardous weather conditions, against all available evidence and alternatives, refused to declare appropriate emergency status, despite clear indications of passenger injuries, and aircraft stress, denied medical diversion for critically injured passengers, and subsequently attempted to intimidate crew members and falsify official records. The words fell into the hearing room like hammer blows, each violation building toward an inevitable conclusion. More disturbing than these individual violations is the pattern of behavior revealed through investigation. Your 28-year career has been characterized by systematic crew intimidation, suppression of safety reporting, and retaliation against subordinates who dared to challenge your judgment. This is not airmanship. This is the abuse of authority that undermines the entire foundation of aviation safety. Morrison paused, letting the weight of her assessment settle over the room. The evidence shows that your decision-making on Flight 2847 was driven by personal pride rather than professional judgment. When Inspector Williams challenged your assumptions at the gate, you made it a personal vendetta. When First Officer Rodriguez questioned your weather assessment, you treated her professional recommendations as insubordination. When severe conditions proved your judgment catastrophically wrong, you refused to acknowledge reality rather than admit error. She pulled out the formal enforcement documents that would end Brennan's aviation career forever. Most damning of all, when passengers under your care suffered injuries that required immediate medical attention, you prioritized avoiding scrutiny over their welfare. Robert Martinez may never fully recover cognitive function because your pride was more important than his brain. The reference to the injured passenger sent a visible shock through Brennan's composure. For the first time during the proceedings, his military bearing cracked, and something approaching human emotion flickered across his face. Effective immediately pursuant to Title 49 of the United States Code and Federal Aviation Regulation 61.15, the Federal Aviation Administration hereby issues emergency revocation of Airline Transport Pilot Certificate number 2847501, issued to Marcus James Brennan. The words hit Brennan like physical blows. His ATP certificate, the credential that had defined his adult identity, that had given him authority over multi-million-dollar aircraft, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of passengers, was being stripped away permanently. Furthermore, Morrison continued, this revocation is permanent and non-appealable. You are prohibited from applying for any pilot certificate or aviation-related employment requiring federal certification. Your name will be entered into the FAA's enforcement database as permanently disqualified from aviation duties. Jerome Williams watched Brennan's face crumble as the reality penetrated. This wasn't a suspension or temporary penalty. It was the complete destruction of everything he had built his life around. Morrison turned her attention to the corporate representatives, Mountain West Airlines. This investigation has revealed systematic failures in safety culture oversight, crew, resource management, and response to safety reporting. Your company's history of protecting Captain Brennan from crew complaints while retaliating against those who filed them demonstrates corporate negligence that borders on criminal conspiracy. The airline's chief counsel straightened as the corporate penalties were announced. Mountain West Airlines is hereby assessed a civil penalty of $2 million for violations of safety management system requirements, failure to maintain adequate oversight of flight operations, systematic suppression of crew safety reporting, and enabling a hostile work environment that endangered passenger safety. Additionally, this airline will undergo mandatory FAA-supervised audit of all safety management systems, complete replacement of senior management, and implementation of anonymous safety reporting systems with third-party oversight. The financial penalty was substantial, but the operational requirements would force fundamental changes in how the airline managed safety culture and crew relations. Chief Pilot Robert Hammond is hereby permanently barred from any position involving oversight of flight operations or crew management. Your pattern of protecting dangerous pilots while retaliating against safety reporting demonstrates unfitness for positions of authority in commercial aviation. Hammond's career had just ended as completely as Brennan's, a recognition that institutional enabling was as dangerous as individual misconduct. Morrison's final words were directed not just to the respondents, but to the aviation industry representatives who had filled the hearing room. Aviation safety depends on the willingness of professional pilots to put passengers first, to listen to crew recommendations, to acknowledge their limitations, and to prioritize truth over image. When ego and pride override these fundamental principles, people die. She looked at each person in the room with the authority that came from having seen too many preventable tragedies. Captain Brennan's career ends today, not because he made one mistake, but because he demonstrated systematic unfitness for the enormous responsibility that comes with airline transport pilot certification. The 189 passengers and crew aboard Flight 2847 survived because of the professionalism of First Officer Rodriguez-led flight attendant Kim and the courage of Inspector Williams to document and report what he witnessed. Morrison gathered her papers and stood. This hearing is adjourned. The FAA's findings and enforcement actions are final and effective immediately. As the room emptied, Captain Marcus Brennan sat alone at the respondents' table, staring at documents that had just transformed him from an airline captain into a civilian with no aviation future. His kingdom in the sky had fallen completely, and there would be no appeal, no second chances, no redemption. Jerome Williams walked past the broken man without stopping. Justice had been served not through revenge, but through the systematic application of federal authority designed to protect innocent people from those who would endanger them through pride, ego, and systematic abuse of power. Maria Martinez approached Brennan's table as he gathered his materials. For a moment, they looked at each other. The wife of the man whose brain he had endangered, and the pilot whose pride had cost her family their future. "I hope you understand now," she said quietly, "that the people who trust you with their lives aren't just passengers. They're somebody's husband, somebody's father, somebody's whole world." Brennan tried to speak, but no words came. She turned and left, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had found meaning in tragedy by ensuring it would never happen again. The skies would be safer without Captain Marcus Brennan in them, and that was justice enough. 6 months after the hearing that ended Captain Marcus Brennan's aviation career, the ripple effects of Flight 2847 were reshaping commercial aviation in ways that extended far beyond individual punishment to systemic reform. Mountain West Airlines had become the subject of intensive federal oversight that bordered on government receivership. The $3.2 million fine was just the beginning. The airline faced mandatory restructuring of its safety management system, complete replacement of senior management, and ongoing FAA supervision that would continue until they demonstrated genuine cultural change. The company's new leadership, brought in specifically to implement reforms, faced the challenge of rebuilding institutional credibility that had been destroyed by years of protecting dangerous pilots while retaliating against those who reported problems. "We're essentially rebuilding the entire company culture from scratch," explained newly appointed Chief Pilot Sarah Martinez, the former first officer whose career had been nearly destroyed by challenging Brennan years earlier. "Every procedure, every policy, every aspect of crew relations has to be examined and rebuilt based on actual safety culture rather than hierarchy protection." The changes at Mountain West were being closely watched throughout the aviation industry. Other airlines were conducting internal audits of their own crew complaint procedures, terrified that similar patterns might exist in their operations. The Flight 2847 case had become required study material at every major carrier, a cautionary tale about the catastrophic costs of toxic command cultures. Jerome Williams had been promoted to Senior Aviation Safety Inspector and assigned to lead the newly created Crew Resource Management Oversight Division, a federal program specifically designed to identify and address intimidation patterns before they could lead to accidents. The Flight 2847 investigation taught us that traditional safety oversight wasn't enough, Jerome explained to a gathering of industry safety professionals. We were inspecting aircraft and procedures, but we weren't adequately examining the human factors and cultural issues that ultimately determine whether those procedures actually protect passengers. The new oversight program required airlines to demonstrate not just compliance with safety regulations, but active promotion of safety reporting culture. Anonymous reporting systems with third-party oversight became mandatory. Crew members received federal protection against retaliation for safety reports. And most significantly, corporate executives became personally liable for suppressing or retaliating against safety communications. First Officer Lisa Rodriguez had been promoted to captain faster than anyone in Mountain West's history, not despite her willingness to challenge authority, but because of it. Her first command was Flight 2847's route, now operated under dramatically different cultural expectations. Every briefing begins with explicit encouragement for crew members to speak up about any safety concern, no matter how minor. Captain Rodriguez explained to her new first officer, James Chen, Thomas Chen's son, whose aviation career had been made possible by the reforms his father's courage had helped create. We've learned that small problems ignored become big problems that kill people. Lisa continued. Nobody's ego is worth a single passenger's life, and anyone who thinks otherwise doesn't belong in this cockpit. The route that had once been Captain Brennan's personal kingdom now represented everything modern aviation safety culture was supposed to embody. Collaborative decision-making, conservative risk assessment, and absolute prioritization of passenger welfare over operational convenience. David Kim had been promoted to Mountain West's Director of Crew Resource Management and was implementing training programs that would ensure no flight attendant would ever again face the moral crisis of watching passengers suffer while being ordered to remain silent. We're training our people to understand that professional courage isn't optional, David explained during a crew meeting. Speaking up about safety concerns isn't insubordination. It's the core requirement of aviation professionalism. Anyone who discourages safety communication will be terminated immediately. The changes extended beyond Mountain West to the entire industry. The Federal Aviation Administration had implemented new regulations requiring airlines to report crew intimidation incidents directly to federal authorities. Union contracts now included specific protections for safety reporting that superseded traditional seniority and discipline procedures. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The Flight 2847 case had shattered the aviation industry's comfortable assumption that professional appearance and technical competence guaranteed good judgment and appropriate character. The investigation had revealed that some of the most dangerous people in aviation wore uniforms with the highest authority markings. The case had also exposed the inadequacy of traditional crew resource management training that focused on communication techniques without addressing the power dynamics and intimidation tactics that prevented effective communication in the first place. New CRM programs now included specific training on recognizing and resisting authority abuse, federal protections for safety reporting, and systematic consequences for any attempt to suppress crew input on safety matters. The most visible symbol of change was the Robert Martinez Aviation Safety Award, established to recognize aviation professionals who demonstrated exceptional courage in challenging authority when safety was at risk, named for the passenger whose brain injury had become a catalyst for industry-wide reform. The first recipient was Thomas Chen, whose vindication had come too late to restore his airline career, but had validated every crew member who had ever been silenced for speaking up about safety. This award represents something more important than individual recognition, Thomas said during the presentation ceremony. It represents the promise that no aviation professional will ever again be punished for putting safety before hierarchy, passengers before pride, or truth before convenience. Robert Martinez himself attended the ceremony. His recovery from traumatic brain injury, slow but steady. He would never fully regain his cognitive abilities, but he had become an advocate for aviation safety reform, speaking at industry conferences about the human cost of command failure. "I don't remember the flight," Robert told the audience, his speech still affected by his injuries. "But I remember trusting my life to professionals who were supposed to protect me. Some of them did their jobs. One of them failed catastrophically. The difference between them saved my life and changed an industry." As the aviation industry continued implementing reforms triggered by the Flight 2847 investigation, the broader implications extended beyond commercial flying to any organization where authority and life safety decisions intersected. Medical institutions began examining their own cultures of hierarchy and intimidation. Military organizations reviewed procedures for reporting safety concerns without career retaliation. Corporate environments, where employees' safety depended on speaking up about dangerous conditions, implemented new protections for whistleblowers. The Flight 22847 case had demonstrated that institutional cultures of intimidation weren't just workplace problems. They were public safety crises that could kill innocent people when unchecked authority met operational pressure. Jerome Williams, now a nationally recognized expert on aviation safety culture, concluded his presentations with words that had become a rallying cry for reform throughout the transportation industry. Safety culture isn't about procedures or regulations or training programs. It's about whether the people with the most authority have the character to listen to the people with the most knowledge. When ego becomes more important than evidence, when hierarchy trumps honesty, when pride overrides prudence, people die. The Flight 2847 incident showed us the cost of failing this test. The reforms that followed show us the value of learning from that failure. The kingdom in the sky had been rebuilt on new foundations, not the divine right of captains, but the professional responsibility of every person who played a role in aviation safety to speak up, listen carefully, and put passenger welfare above every other consideration. It was a revolution that had been paid for in injured passengers and destroyed careers, but had ultimately made the skies safer for everyone who trusted their lives to commercial aviation professionals worthy of that sacred responsibility. 1 year after the federal hearing that ended his aviation career, Marcus Brennan stood in front of a classroom of student pilots at Desert Sky Flight Academy in rural Arizona. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had once commanded multi-million-dollar aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers was now teaching basic aerodynamics to teenagers hoping to earn private pilot certificates. The most dangerous attitude in aviation, Brennan told his students, his voice carrying none of the arrogant authority it had once projected, is the belief that experience makes you immune to mistakes. I learned that lesson in the most devastating way possible, and it cost me everything I thought defined me as a person. His students knew him simply as Mr. Brennan, a ground school instructor with an impressive aviation background who seemed surprisingly humble for someone with decades of flying experience. They didn't know about Flight 2847, the federal investigation, or the spectacular career destruction that had brought him to this small desert airfield. But Brennan knew, and the knowledge had fundamentally changed him in ways that federal enforcement never could. He woke up every morning aware that 189 people had nearly died because of his pride, and that Robert Martinez might never fully recover because a 15-minute medical diversion had been less important than his ego. Today we're going to discuss crew resource management. Brennan continued pulling up a presentation that would have been unthinkable during his airline days. This is the art of using all available resources, including the knowledge and observations of people who might have less experience but different perspectives to make the best possible decisions. The curriculum he taught now emphasized humility, collaboration, and the professional courage required to admit mistakes and accept input from others. His students were learning not just how to fly aircraft, but how to be the kind of aviators who would never repeat his failures. Remember, he told them passengers trust you with their lives, their futures, their family's welfare. That trust is sacred, and it must be honored through every decision you make every day you fly for your entire aviation career. 300 miles away in Miami, Captain Lisa Rodriguez was conducting the pre-flight briefing for Mountain West Flight 2847, the same flight number, same route, but now operated under a completely transformed safety culture. Weather shows some buildups over Central Florida, Lisa told her crew. ATC is offering early deviations, and we'll take whatever routing keeps our passengers most comfortable. There's no schedule pressure worth flying into weather we can easily avoid. Her first officer, James Chen, Thomas Chen's son, whose aviation career had been made possible by the reforms his father's courage had helped create, nodded his agreement. Looks like we can stay well clear of everything and still arrive on time. The collaborative decision-making that characterized the new Flight 2847 would have been impossible under Captain Brennan's command style. But it represented everything that modern aviation safety culture was supposed to embody. Conservative risk assessment, crew input, encouraged and valued passenger comfort, prioritized over operational convenience. In the cabin, David Kim was briefing a crew that included several flight attendants who had been inspired to join aviation specifically because of the reforms that followed the original Flight 2847 incident. They understood that their role extended beyond service excellence to safety oversight, and that speaking up about concerns wasn't just permitted, it was their professional obligation. The cultural transformation at Mountain West Airlines had been comprehensive and painful. The $3.2 million federal fine had been just the beginning of costs that ultimately exceeded $75 million when settlement payments to injured passengers' legal fees, operational disruptions, and management restructuring were included. But the investment in genuine safety culture reform had paid dividends in passenger confidence, crew morale, and operational safety that extended far beyond regulatory compliance. Inspector Jerome Williams was in Seattle conducting a follow-up audit of Mountain West's safety culture improvements when news reached him about Marcus Brennan's current situation. The former airline captain was not only teaching ground school, but had become an advocate for aviation safety reform, speaking at industry conferences about the dangers of toxic command culture. Mr. Brennan's personal transformation doesn't excuse what he did. Jerome reflected during an interview with Aviation Safety magazine. But it demonstrates that even people who make terrible decisions can contribute to preventing similar failures if they're willing to accept responsibility and help others learn from their mistakes. Jerome's own career had been transformed by the Flight 2847 investigation. His documentation methods were now taught at every FAA training facility, and the Crew Resource Management Oversight Division he led was identifying and addressing intimidation patterns at airlines throughout the country. At Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, Robert Martinez was undergoing his final cognitive assessment 1 year after the traumatic brain injury that had changed his life forever. His recovery had been remarkable, but incomplete. He would never fully regain the mental acuity he possessed before Flight 2847. But he had found new purpose as an advocate for aviation safety reform. "I don't remember the flight," Robert told Dr. Martinez. No relation, his speech still showing effects of the brain trauma. "But I remember trusting my life to people I thought were professionals. Most of them were. One of them failed catastrophically. The difference between them saved my life and changed an industry. Robert's family had received a substantial settlement from Mountain West Airlines, but more importantly, his case had become the catalyst for reforms that would protect countless future passengers from similar injuries. Thomas Chen's flight school in Arizona had become a pilgrimage site for aviation professionals seeking to understand how safety culture could be rebuilt after catastrophic failure. His students understood that professional aviation wasn't about projecting authority. It was about accepting responsibility for the lives entrusted to their care. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across runways, where the next generation of aviators was learning to fly with humility rather than hubris. The legacy of Flight 2847 continued to reshape American aviation. The kingdom in the sky had been transformed from a hierarchy of fear into a community of professionals united by their commitment to safety, honesty, and the understanding that their greatest authority came not from the power to command, but from the wisdom to serve those who trusted them with their lives. In aviation, as in life, true leadership meant making everyone around you safer, not making everyone around you afraid. The flight was over, but the lessons would endure forever. This story serves as a powerful reminder that pride and unchecked authority can have devastating consequences, while courage and integrity can transform entire industries. If you found this story compelling and believe that accountability matters in every profession, please share this video with others who need to hear this message. Hit that like button if you believe that speaking up for safety should never be punished, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories where justice prevails and systems change for the better. Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people and creates awareness about the need for transparency and accountability in all aspects of life. Remember, every person who finds the courage to challenge dangerous authority makes the world a little safer for everyone. Share this story, spread the message, and help ensure that no one else has to suffer, because someone's pride was more important than their responsibility to protect human lives. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter.